Okay, welcome to Thursday's lecture, and today we're going to highlight a key question and a couple of important themes that you're reading about and covering in other material from China's War of Resistance against Japan or the Second World War period from 1937 to 1945. And the question that I want you to think about today and also into next week is which experiences had by the Chinese in the Second World War have the most visible impact on the post-war era. So what's happening in these years that's going to bleed over and shape the foundations of the new state and society in the 1950s and 1960s. The themes to explore are the ways in which the war altered the balance of power between the Nationalist and Chinese Communist Party. And we're going to look at governance, the countryside, ideology, and especially as we get to the end of the lecture, to talk a little bit about the intervention of the United States and the search for a coalition government. But let's kind of pick up where we left off on the last lecture with the Kuomintang. Defeated in major battles all along the coast in 1937 and 1938, the Nanjing government retreated far into the west to set up a new capital in Chongqing in Sichuan province. It was an area well protected, kind of a rice bowl surrounded by jagged mountains and swift rivers, but it was unpleasantly humid with oppressive heat in the summers, and there the Kuomintang suffered from a number of critical problems that would ultimately weaken their hold on the rest of China and their prospects for control in the post-war era. First off, the regime was now essentially a fugitive party ruling over a mountain-ringed redoubt in Sichuan province that was often completely isolated from the outside world. Japan's expansion threatened supply lines from Burma and Vietnam, and forced outside of the Yangtze region that had been its base of power, the government was on the home turf of provincial militarists, what we've been calling warlords, and local landlords that had only nominally been under its authority. Compounding that political problem of power and authority was a fiscal crisis. The retreat had left the Kuomintang without the customs and opium that was much of its revenue, which drew most heavily from Shanghai. Its wartime capital in Chongqing looked to solve that problem in two ways, which both proved to be disastrous choices. The first was through the printing press. They simply made more money, which started a crisis with inflation that the government wasn't able to solve until its exile in Taiwan. The second course of action was to abuse power. The Kuomintang issued all kinds of new taxes, conscriptions of new recruits and corvée labor to be able to function as a state and sustain its war effort in defense of China against Japan. Most of its revenue was generated by taxing grain, while new taxes to supplement that trade spread like weeds. They demanded locals make straw sandals for new recruits, or that their families entertain and quote-unquote comfort soldiers, which entailed all kinds of abuses. Many rural Chinese families having their able-bodied men conscripted to fights were in poorly equipped and trained units for the Kuomintang. It seemed to them that the Chongqing basically would expend all that they had in order to preserve their own power. Fearing unrest and questioning the loyalty of the people within their territory, the Kuomintang fell back on strong-arm methods. They used secret police and intimidation to silence critics. Radicals left this area of Free China, drifting northward towards the CCP's base in Yan'an, the CCP, Chinese Communist Party, while the methods poisoned the party's reputation with liberal students, professors, journalists, and the middle class. From a military standpoint, the Kuomintang also staggered into the post-war era because it lost much of its most effective divisions and armies trying to reopen the Burma Road and then defending against the Japanese Ichigo offensive that took place in Henan as it drove to capitalize on the Chongqing's capital. This was especially true after the Kuomintang abandoned the United Front in 1941 with its attack on the new Fourth Army, an army raised by the communists in central and northern China, and essentially shifted from a nationalist defense of the homeland against the Japanese invaders into a two-front war and preparations to resume the civil war struggle with the communists after the defeat of Japan. So essentially, they were reserving a lot of military forces that could have been used later in the war, and its best divisions were lost, in part because of poor military planning. It was in Henan that the Kuomintang's weaknesses as a government proved most lethal. A famine struck this largely rural, very impoverished area that was once the cultural heartland of ancient Chinese dynasties in 1942 and 1943. The people of Henan were surrounded by the armies of the Japanese, the Nationalists, and the Chinese Communist Party on all sides, and thus they were doomed to starvation as soldiers, landlords, and petty officials hoarded supplies, especially food, and profited from inflation. Between 2 and 3 million people died in Henan of hunger there over that time period. The neglect of the countryside, which had been a weakness of the Nanjing government in the nationalist decade from 1927 to 1937, could be said to have mutated in the Second World War into a fatalistic flaw. Rural Chinese were looked upon by the government in Chongqing and Chiang Kai-shek as an inexhaustible resource and cannon fodder to throw at the Japanese. And that recognition of that perspective alienated a lot of rural and peripheral areas within Free China. Meanwhile, in North China, the Chinese Communist Party had emerged from the wilderness years spent on the Long March and the onslaught of Japan by the early 1940s to be stronger than ever. It is a rather simple thesis that many historians have long taken to explaining what happened to communism in China over the course of the Second World War, and that is that the war weakened the nationalists and strengthened the communists. But that simplicity obscures the innovations, key decisions, and strategies made by the CCP themselves. It would ultimately make them the agents behind their own destiny to launch a victorious revolution over the course of the next decade. Indeed, before the war, the experiences of the Long March had nearly crushed the communist movement. But its survival meant that it arrived in North China with a party of dedicated, altruistic members, cadres experienced in running campaigns, propaganda, working alongside and with villagers, and running guerrilla operations designed to take back power. Most important were the efforts made to synthesize Marxist theory, meaning to define and express communism in terms relatable to the Chinese experience and using their own ideas, cultural heritage, and philosophy. At the forefront of this in the early 1940s was Mao Zedong, who had risen in the ranks as others fell within the upper echelons of the party on the Long March. Chinese intellectuals before him had already put down a solid foundation by translating concepts such as the proletariat into an idea called Wuchan Jieji, meaning a propertyless class. It was more suitable to China since it could include both urban industrial workers, which were far fewer in the population of 400 plus million, and also laboring farmers, of which the vast majority of Chinese people could be found in this class. While in Yunnan, Mao put himself through a rigorous education of Marxist literature, kind of his own graduate program. But he also began tailoring those concepts and theories to appeal to a wide number of Chinese and to make them seem less foreign. This process started to emerge with his essay, New Democracy. It showcased his flexibility in thought, mixing short-term and long-term goals alternatively. It also laid the foundation for Chinese communism to distinguish itself by several key principles from the Soviet Union, from Marx, from Lenin, and especially from Stalin. The first was to launch itself through mobilization in the countryside with peasants by studying their conditions and their lifestyles, and providing them a means through the party and communism to achieve their life's ambitions and desires. In North China, the Chinese Communist Party offered them peace, order, security, in contrast to how the Kuomintang in Free China made them a resource to be exploited. The People's Liberation Army was encouraged to help rural peasants harvest crops and to socialize with them as equals. This process expressed a second principle, what was known as the mass line, a kind of Chinese-style democracy wherein the party worked with the masses, studied their problems, passed that information upward to leadership, who then would create a plan, a solution that was sent back down to the cadre to work alongside commoners to implement that fix. Beyond encouraging direct participation in politics of groups often excluded and encouraged to be submissive or deferential to their social betters, the Chinese Communist Party could claim to represent the true interests of locals and commoners because it was there, in the village, working alongside them at the same tasks and sharing their lifestyle. It was not distancing itself from the people as elites, as had been common in the past. And yet, it also reaffirmed the need for hierarchy and preserved for the party the right to decide the right course of action and solution to problems faced by China as a nation. The last key defining characteristic of the Sinification of Marxism then was its flexibility as a movement, an ability to manage glaring ideological contradictions without, let's say, discouraging those that were joining in vast numbers, without alienating the populace. In areas where the CCP was firmly in control, Mao used class struggle and land reform. He persecuted landlords and redistributed land among poor peasants, watching the ranks of his party and party swell as a result. People were actually driven to communism by the idea that they might get private property, an irony that probably would have appalled many hardcore Marxists in the early 20th century. In other areas where authority and allegiances were divided between the CCP, Japanese, and also the Kuomintang, Mao was smart to extol the virtues of a united front against Japan and of all classes, landlords and peasants working together. The same was true of how he positioned its relationship to the Soviet Union and Comintern. At times, Mao stressed the complete and total independence in thought and practice that the Chinese Communist Party had from Moscow, marking his movement as a nationalist endeavor and enterprise. And at others, he played upon its ties to the Soviets to gain from this idea that China was now part of a wider world revolution and international community. It was also true that these ideological contradictions didn't seem to matter as much in the context of war. The presence of a marauding Japanese army in the north meant that people flocked to the Chinese Communist Party, seeing them as patriots and the last line of defense between Chinese civilization and complete and total domination by a foreign power. In 1940, the CCP was actually in a position then to launch a major offensive under the leadership of General Peng Dehuai, what is known as the 100 Regiments Offensive. The brutality of the Japanese response, known as the kill all, burn all, loot all, or 3 alls, devastated North China, meaning there wasn't much of a military victory to be had for the communists. But the Communist Party in North China turned it into a massive political victory via propaganda. Radio, dramas, posters, pamphlets by the CCP made claims that within the United Front, it was actually North China and its people, led by the communists, that was bearing the brunt of the fight against Japan, while Chiang Kai-shek and elites hid back in the far-removed territory of Chongqing, savoring his weapons and his best troops for a civil war to fight Chinese against Chinese. The elevation of Mao and his thinking to the apex of the party, later enshrined in its new constitution in 1945, reflected a need to forge solidarity within the party amidst unprecedented growth. Here with Spence, you're reading about how the party itself and its army grows from a few thousand people to several 100,000 members in the course of the Second World War. Mao needed to forge solidarity. He needed to make sure that the members coming in were disciplined, progressive, and ready to act rather than collaborate or be corrupt bureaucrats. In this respect, they were particularly influenced by their understanding of the weaknesses of the Kuomintang from working inside that party. That regime suffered from intense factionalism. So the Chinese communists strove for consensus and something that would give them objectivity. The ideas, theories, speeches, and lectures of a given leader, in this case Mao. So from 1942 to 1944, the leadership of the Chinese Communist Party launched the Yan'an Rectification Campaign, a process of political mobilization to create unity in ideology and discipline new members of the movement. The methods were a mixture of study and political training that used terror and psychological warfare against individualistic strains of thoughts. The targets of this campaign I'm going to touch on in the next video because I have just run out of time.